Good evening and welcome to Law and Order, brought to you exclusively by Channeleye. Tonight, we will be paying attention to an area of law that has been getting quite a lot of interest from the public over the past couple of years. And that is quite simply because it is because of an entry of a particular act into the body of law here in Sri Lanka as recently as in the year 2016. What is this area of law? It is none other than the right to information. And to help us to get to the bottom of what this right entails, we have with us today the manager of the Right to Information program of Transparency International Sri Lanka, Ms. Sankitha Gunaratna.
Hello.
Good evening, Sankitha.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And
Thanks
how are you?
so much for accepting my invitation to be here with me tonight.
No problem.
So let's get down to the nitty-gritties. What is the right to information?
The right to information is considered part of the freedom of expression. So the idea is that to express yourself accurately, you need to have proper and exact information, accurate information. So the right to information as it stands now in Sri Lanka is the right for any citizen to access information that is held by a public authority. Now a public authority is any institution of the state, certain NGOs, certain private organizations as well. So often we talk about right to information only as this process of requesting and getting information. But there is another pillar of right to information that is as important, and that's called proactive disclosure. That is when the state has to, or public authorities have to disclose information without citizens having to request it and without them having to pay for it. So you proactively disclose information so that you basically usher in a space for open government, accountability and transparency to the citizen. So that's the basic idea, that a citizen can access information from a public authority.
You mentioned that the right to information comes under the right of expression,
Yes.
which is one of the fundamental rights that is guaranteed in our constitution. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how the right to information comes under the right of every citizen to express himself?
Right. So internationally also, the right of access to information is recognized. The right to receive information is recognized as part of the right of freedom of expression. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, both recognize this and mention the right to information as well. Now in Sri Lanka also, we've had the freedom of expression in this constitution for several decades now. And even before this new act came into being, the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, through freedom of expression cases, held and basically acknowledged that to express yourself, to be able to actively participate, you need to have access to accurate information. So through that means you had the freedom of information. But now what has happened is through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, a provision was introduced, a new right, a fundamental right was introduced, ensuring that every citizen should have a right of access to information. So it goes a step further in that it sets in black and white, sets down in black and white a process. So it becomes a right. It goes beyond just the availability. It actually shows how you can get it.
I see.
And it's time bound as well.
So through many years of judicial activism, our courts, the Supreme Court, has allowed for the right to information under the limb of right to expression.
Yes.
But now, as you, correct me if I'm wrong, but through the 19th Amendment, what has happened is it is now a right that is expressly guaranteed through our constitution. Am I right?
You're right. And the 19th Amendment in that provision actually stated that this will be set out by law. And that's where the Right to Information Act comes into play.
I see.
So the 19th Amendment was passed in May 2015, and then it provided for a law, and so that law was passed in August 2016. So then there are two angles to this. Now the constitutional right, because you know a fundamental right is something we can action that is justiciable before the Supreme Court. So you can go directly to the Supreme Court. Now in the right of access to information in the Constitution, it mentions that your right of access to information is to information that relates to the exercise of another right. So it's a corollary right to the exercise of a different right. Whereas in the act is a bit broader, where it says you can get information just for the sake of having information. So you don't have to justify it in relation to another right. You don't have to say, I need this information to exercise my right to freedom of expression, or to exercise my right to freedom from arbitrary detention or torture. You don't have to establish that with the act. So if you have that kind of instance, you go straight to the Supreme Court. Then this, through the Right to Information Act, what's set in place is a process, a simple process, where every public authority, every school, every police station, every divisional secretariat, every district secretariat has an information officer that you can petition just by way of a simple single A4 sheet application form, and then they have a specific time within which they are bound to give you the information. So it's a very simple process that's brought in through the Act.
So basically that is a synopsis of what led to the promulgation of the Act in 2016, Act number 12 of 2016. And you mentioned that this is only with regards to a private citizen's right to obtain information from a public authority. So you mentioned provincial councils and so on and so forth. So how would a citizen be able to hold a public, someone who is an authority in a public institution, hold that person account in terms of the Act?
So what's most attractive about this right is that, and this Act, is that it's time bound.
It's time bound.
It's time bound. So when you use this RTI 1 application form, you can use the form, you can just do it by way of a letter if you like. So you send an information request, just titled an information request, to the information officer of any public authority. So say you want to ask your divisional secretary about a land allocation. So you send an application form asking who in this area has been granted land, you know, and what amount of, what's the acreage or something like that. And you just need to address it to the information officer, divisional secretary of this area. They have to acknowledge the request immediately, and within 14 days they have to write to you stating whether or not they will be providing the information to you.
Within 14 days the petition being presented? Of
it being presented. Okay. So it's a very short turnaround time. And they respond saying, I will give you the information, we've decided to give you the information, or we've decided not to give you the information for these reasons.
I see.
Now, those reasons also have to be those that are captured in the Act itself. You can't just give reasons willy-nilly. So now, assume they stated that they would give you the information. Within 14 days of that notice, they're bound to give you the information. So within approximately 1 month, you should have the information in hand. Now, if they refuse the information, or if they fail to provide sufficient information or satisfactory information, then you can appeal to somebody called a designated officer. That's usually the head of that same public institution. So they've decentralized it so that at the same level you can try and resolve the issue. So the appeal is again a one-page document. You underline the reason for appeal, explain what happened. You can say they didn't respond within time, or they unreasonably rejected your information request, and you send in the appeal. Again, just a letter sent by registered post. You can call it in. You can always email. You can use all of these methods. And then to that, they're bound to respond within 21 days. So within 3 weeks, the designated officer has to respond. Again, if they don't, you can appeal to the RTI Commission. There have been hundreds of cases that have gone before the Commission. A simple proceeding at a very informal commission. You don't need lawyers to appear before that. So that level of accountability is available because they are bound by time. They're bound by very concrete, reasonable reasons for rejection. So That's how we hold them
So
accountable.
that would be the basic process
Yes.
involved. So to put it in a nutshell, the hierarchy is first the information officer, and if you are dissatisfied with the information that you've got from
Yes.
the information officer, then you will present an appeal to the
Designated officer.
within 21 days.
Your appeal should be within 14 days.
Within 14
And
days.
they're bound to respond within 21 days.
Right. And if you're still not satisfied, you can then petition the commission.
Commission within 2 months.
Within 2 months. Now, is it through the Act that these information officers and designated officers have been appointed?
Yes. So the Act foresaw within 3 months of the Act being certified, that's the 4th of August 2016, that information officers had to be appointed. Now, people see it as a challenge actually that information officers have not been appointed in certain public authorities. And people say, what happens if there has been no information officer appointed? Now, the Act has foreseen this, and it has said that if an information officer is not appointed, the head of the public authority will be deemed to be the information officer. So, as I mentioned before, all you have to do is send the request to the information officer by designation, and the public authority is bound to respond within the specific timelines. A citizen doesn't need to be concerned about the non-appointment of an information officer.
So, any head of that whatever public institution, if there is no designated officer or information officer, the head is deemed to be the information officer for
yes.
that.
Okay.
Now, Sanketa, just a little bit of background into this. Now, I've read that in India, the reason that the Right to Information Act was introduced was because citizens, there was a movement on the part of the public,
Yes.
and this created some form of pressure on the parliament in India, and that led to the Right to Information Act in India. Would you be able to educate our viewers on whether there was such a movement in Sri Lanka, or whether it just came into place?
Yes, so in Sri Lanka, the process was significantly different. There was no citizen movement for the right to information. What happened was in 1993, there was a committee appointed to look into the freedom of, to look into media freedom and freedom of expression in the context of media freedom. And this is generally referred to as the RKW Gunasekara Committee, and they in their recommendations proposed that a right to information law should be introduced to Sri Lanka.
Way
and
back
then
in 1993.
1993. This is why we call it a struggle of over 20 years.
Right.
But there were different challenges through the years. So in 1996, the Freedom of Information Bill was drafted but was never brought to Parliament. Then in the year 2000, the right to information was part of the proposed fundamental rights chapter in the proposed constitution, the draft constitution. Again, that did not see the light of day.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then in 2003, there was a bipartisan approach, effort to draft a good right to information law. And in fact, that was what formed the basis of the final law that came into play in 2016. So in 2003, in 2004, cabinet approval was granted, but then the government did not proceed with it. It didn't come to Parliament again. Again in 2009 and 11 it was brought before Parliament. Once it was defeated, once Parliament was dissolved. So through the years this has not succeeded for various reasons, practical reasons, as well as the fact that a right to information law is always uncomfortable for any government in power. Even in the UK we see Tony Blair talking about the need for a right to information in 2003, and then years later cursing himself really for having introduced such a law, because it gets really problematic. He called himself, he said that it was almost unreasonable to expect it of a government.
And this
However,
is the United Kingdom.
This is the United Kingdom we are talking about. So it's not an easy law to have to grapple with, but it's very nice to see that across the board, across political parties, there has been commitment to this law in Sri Lanka, but due to practical difficulties, it never came into effect until 2015. 15 and then 16. So that's a bit of background. So it was, part of, the election promises of both parties even throughout the years. So now we have finally seen it approved by almost with no dissenting votes in Parliament, really, which is quite a significant, an encouraging development. And now we see it being used by people not at these high levels that we think of. We are not thinking holding government accountable. We are not thinking big issues. Just the average person files an RTI about their Samurdhi application. Why have I not got my Samurdhi? Or who has been selected to get Samurdhi? How many people applied? How many people got it? How much money are they getting? Or is there drought relief allocated by the government for the drought that just happened in 2017? So what is the criteria being used to admit children into school? So that's how it's relevant to the average person. Even though it wasn't the result of a citizens' movement, we see it being used exceedingly by the average person, and not only in Colombo, in the peripheries of Sri Lanka. We've seen success stories, even the national channels have shown success stories of how people have used RTI to get their solutions also. RTI is generally about getting information, but in Sinipura we saw in the Trincomalee district, people filing RTIs asking why letters were not being delivered to their homes.
Oh, I see.
Because the postman used to leave the letters at the shop at the bunt. Okay. So when the RTI was filed, they had to spring into action.
Oh,
they didn't respond to the RTI, but the letters started getting delivered to the houses. So
because they realized that they would now have to respond to the RTI.
Exactly, and there's a level of accountability that you encounter when you understand that someone is watching you. Sometimes in areas where the supervisory structure has failed, public scrutiny through RTI has now brought that level of accountability.
So public scrutiny, what form does public scrutiny take usually in your experience?
So it can happen in different ways. There can be social audits, slightly more high level things, but a simple RTI application form telling a public official that we want to know about a certain contract that was awarded. We want to have a sample of the material that was used in the road in front of our house. The fact that someone's asking it means that you'll be less likely to misappropriate government funding, to be inefficient. All of that it's not always necessarily intentional corruption that we are trying to uncover through this. What we are looking for is really our solution to our problem. Sometimes it's of course useful to question government processes, to want to understand how government works, or how fiscal processes works, or how people are appointed, whether the process was followed. But this is a much simpler tool that ensures transparency and ensures accountability.
It's quite interesting. Even though, unlike in India, there was a citizens' movement which culminated in the promulgation of the Right to Information Act in India, in Sri Lanka, it was completely different. It was way back in 1993, and as you said, it took a long 13 years for an act to be introduced into our body of law which would crystallize the citizens' right to information.
Yes, in fact, over the years there have been civil society activists, media activists, politicians who have really struggled to bring this law across. It wasn't one faction of people that were fighting for it. There was a sustained struggle through the years.
So it just goes to show that a little bit of tenacity and resilience does go a long way, isn't it?
Yes, ultimately.
So, in your capacity as a manager of the RTI program at Transparency International Sri Lanka, what kind of work do you oversee?
We have several programs. One of the main functions we perform is that we give free legal advice on right to information related work to citizens. We have a different arm that gives you free legal advice to victims and witnesses of corruption, But as part of that, we also help people to fill RTI applications. So since the RTI Act was operationalized on the 3rd of February last year, 2017, we have assisted about 1,400 RTI applications.
1,400 since 2017 February.
February 3rd, yes. And this means anyone can walk into our office, call us, and get assistance on how to file an application, how to draft their questions in accordance with the law. It's not a complicated process really. And then we will help them to keep track of their appeal dates, because people tend to send the original application form and they don't know about the appeal, the time periods that apply to them as well. Then their application lapses. So what we do is we help them to keep track of by when to file an appeal. We help them draft it, and we generally make it a point to only help them once, because citizens need to be empowered. They need to take control of this. This is not about TI or any other organization pushing it. It's their thing and it's their right. And it's a very simple process that tends to be extremely empowering.
So,
that's
go ahead.
That's part of the work we do. We also carry out awareness raising campaigns. So we have something called an RTI van that has gone across several districts, about 8 districts by now, where we show a movie on RTI, help people file RTIs on the spot. We do street dramas around Right to Information Day. We've run advertisements, even the national state channels, including this one, has run advertisements about how this right is actioned, what the process is, how it helps you to hold the state accountable. That's part of the work we do. We also file RTIs as TI, as an organization.
On behalf of the public?
In the public interest, yes.
Okay.
Related to election issues, campaign finance issues, on open government related issues, on general corruption related issues. We use the right to information as well. In addition to this, we are just committed to being at the forefront of RTI knowledge and experience as well.
So, unfortunately, Sankita, we don't have too much of time this week, but I think you've covered a very huge area of the right to information. But just to sign off, by way of summary, could you just tell our viewers why this right to information is so important, and why we as citizens should not ignore the existence of this law? If you can just educate our viewers on that.
So, in terms of why the right to information is important, what we do when we appoint our representatives, when we pay taxes, is that we enter into a social contract with those who govern us, those who have been vested with this responsibility of using this power that we give in our best interest. So generally when we go to a public authority, what we are confronted with is, why do you need to know this? How is this related to you? Can you come later? And that's the level of our experience when we encounter the state. What happens through the right to information is that it equalizes that balance. It resets that balance in favor of the citizen who has vested that power. So you are the real holder of that power. And also the information that the state holds is really our information. It's held in trust for us. So through this, we can engage with the state, holding our head high, knowing that we have been empowered through this law. So it resets that equation. And why it's important is that it allows us to participate in governance. And it also takes away that excuse of, we don't know what's going on. All of our money is being stolen. Or, we tend to make allegations that are unsubstantiated. So through this law, just as you have a right, you have a responsibility to be better informed, to be more involved in governance and participate.
To be a more responsible citizen, if
exactly,
I should say so. Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, well, that's unfortunately all we have time for. Now you have it, ladies and gentlemen, quite succinctly covering what the Right to Information Act is, in actual fact, before that, what the right to information is, and how it led to the introduction of this law to Sri Lanka. I would like to thank Ms. Sankita Gunaratna one more time for taking time off her busy schedule, managing this very important aspect. It has been a pleasure having you. I trust you, ladies and gentlemen, have enjoyed this evening's program. We will see you next week at the same time. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.